efficient, little more than mobile lichen. But it was a start. Birth and death began to replace fission as the premier method of reproduction. Mutations crept in, sometimes producing improvements, more often resulting in inviability. Failed strains were rapidly culled by merciless nature. Divergence appeared, the dawn of a million species. DNA strands lengthened, a chemical record of progress and blind alleys. Crawling creatures emerged onto the lakesides, only to be scalded by the harsh chemicals making up the atmosphere. Yet they persisted. Life was a steady progression, following a pattern which was as standard as circumstances would allow. There were no such things as ice ages to alter the direction which this world's creatures were taking, no instabilities causing profound climate changes, only the 9 yearly storms, appearing without fail, which became the dominant influence. The new animals' breeding cycles were structured around it. Plant growth was restricted by it. The planet matured into a jungle world, a landscape of swamps and lush verdancy, where giant ferns covered the surface from pole to pole, and were themselves webbed and choked with tenacious creepers reaching for the clear sky. Floating weeds turned the smaller lakes into vast marshlands. Elaborate rough flowers vied for the attention of insects and birds. Seed pods with skirts of hardened petals flew like kites through the air. Wood was non-existent, of course. Wood required decades of uninterrupted growth to form. Two wildly different flora genealogies sprang up, with the Terminator as an unbreachable dividing line and battleground. Far-side plants adapted to the sun's yellow light. They were capable of tolerating the long nights accompanying conjunction, the cooler temperatures. Nearside was the province of red light, falling without end. Its black-leafed plants were taller, stronger, more vigorous, yet they were unable to conquer Farside. Night killed them. Yellow light alone was insufficient to drive their demanding photosynthesis, and the scattered refraction of red light by the thick atmosphere never carried far enough, haunting the land for a couple of 100 kilometers beyond the Terminator. The animals were more adaptive, ranging freely across Farside and Nearside. Dinosaur analogues never appeared. They were too big, requiring too much time to grow. Apart from bird analogues, lizard creatures with membranous wings, most animals were smallish, reflecting their aquatic heritage. All were cold-blooded, at home in the muddy streams and weed-clogged pools. They retained that ancestral trait out of pure necessity, for that was where their eggs were laid, buried deep and safe in the mud of the lake beds, hidden away from the worst ravages of the storm. That was how all life survived while the winds scoured the world, as seeds and eggs and spores, ready to surge forth when stability returned in a few short weeks. On such an inimical world, life can evolve in one of two ways. There are the defeated, littered on countless planets across the cosmos, weak, anemic creatures, huddled in their dead-end sanctuaries, a little protective niche in the local ecology, never rising above a rudimentary level, their very lack of sophistication providing them with the means of continuation. Or there are the triumphant, the creatures which refuse to be beaten, which fight tooth and nail and claw and tentacle against their adversity, those for which circumstances act as an evolutionary spur. The dividing line is thin. It might even be that a devastating storm every 8 years could bring genetic ruination. But 9 years, 9 proved enough time to ensure survival, allowing the denizens to rise to the challenge, rather than sink back into their ubiquitous mires. The Lysilph claimed such a victory. A mere 800 million years after life had begun on their world, they had reached their pinnacle of evolution. They became transcendent entities. Their 9-year cycle starts in a fish form, hatching from the black egg clusters concealed below the mud. Billions of free-floating slugs emerge, 2 centimeters long, and are eaten by faster, meaner predators as they gorge themselves on the abundant slug. sludge of decayed vegetation putrefying in the water. They grow and change over 3 years, losing their tails, developing a snail-like skirt. They cling to the bottom of their lakes, an ovoid body 90 centimeters high, with 10 tentacles rising up from the crown. The tentacles are smooth, 60 centimeters long, devoid of suckers, but with a sharp curved horn on the tip, and they're fast, exploding like a nest of enraged pythons to snatch their ignorant prey swimming overhead. When their full size has been reached, they slide up out of the water to range through the planet-wide jungle. Gills adapt to breathe the harsh, musky air. Tentacle muscles strengthen to support the drooping limbs away from the water's cozy buoyancy. And they eat, rummaging through the matted undergrowth with insistent horns to find the black, wizened, nut-like nodes that have been lying there neglected since the storm. The nodes are made up of cells saturated with chemical memory traces, memories containing information, the knowledge accumulated by the life-self race throughout time. They bring understanding, an instant leap to sentience, and trigger the telepathic center of their brains. Now they have risen above a simple animal level of existence, they have much to converse about. The knowledge is mainly of a philosophical nature, although mathematics is highly developed. What they know is what they have observed and speculated upon and added to with each generation. Farside night acts as a magnet as they gather to observe the stars. Eyes and minds linked by telepathy, acting as a gigantic multi-segment telescope. There is no technology, no economy. Their culture is not orientated towards the mechanical or materialistic. Their knowledge is their wealth. The data processing capacity of their linked minds far exceeds that of any electronic computer system, and their perception is not limited to the meager electromagnetic wavelengths of the optical bands. Once awoken, they learn. It is their purpose. They have so little time in their corporeal form, and the universe they find themselves in, the splendor of the gas supergiant and its multifarious satellites, is large. Nature has ordained them as gatherers of knowledge. If life has a purpose, they speculate, then it must be a journey to complete understanding. In that respect, intellect and nature have come to a smooth concordance. In the 9th year after their hatching, the 4 large innermost moons line up once more. The distortion they cause in the supergiant's magnetosphere acts like an extension to the flux tube. The agitated particles of the ionosphere, which use it as a conduit up to the first moon's plasma torus, now find themselves rising higher, up to the 2nd moon, then the 3rd, higher still, fountaining out of the magnetosphere altogether. The Lysilph world swings round into their path. It is not a tight directed beam. Up at the mushrooming crown, the protons and electrons and neutrons have none of the energy they possessed when the roiling flux lines flung them past the first moon. But as always, it is the sheer scale of events within the gas supergiant's domain which proves so overwhelming. The Lysilph world takes 10 hours to traverse through the invisible cloud of ions loitering outside the flux lines. In that time, the energy which floods into the atmosphere is more than sufficient to destroy the equilibrium of the slowly circulating convection currents. The deluge arrives at the end of the planet's one and only mating season. The Lysilph and their non-sentient cousins have produced their eggs and secreted them into the lake beds. Plants have flowered and scattered their seeds across the landscape. Now there is only the prospect of death. When the first titanic bursts of azure lightning break overhead, the Lysilph stop their analyzing and deliberations and begin to impart all they know into the empty cells of the nodes which have grown out of their skin like warts around the base of their tentacles. The winds howl, voicing the planet's torment. Gusts are strong enough to break the meter-thick stems of the fern trees. Once one goes, it starts a domino effect in the jungle. Destruction spreads out in vast ripples, looking like bomb blasts from above. Clouds are torn apart by the violence, reduced to cotton tufts, spinning frantically in the grip of small, ferocious whirlwinds. Micro-typhoons plunge back and forth, accelerating the obliteration of the jungle. All the while, the Lysilph remain steadfast, their adhesive skirts anchoring them to the ground as the air around them fills with broken fronds and shredded leaves. The nodes, now saturated with their precious heritage, drop off like ripe fruit. They will lie hidden amongst the grass and roots for another 3 years. Nearside is ablaze with potent light storms. High above the tattered clouds, the aurora borealis forms a veil across the sky, a garish mother-of-pearl haze, riddled with thousands of long, lurid scintillations, like giant shooting stars. Beyond that, the conjunction is joined, 3 moons sliding into alignment, bathed in an eerie, trillion-amp phosphorescence, an epicenter to one of the gas supergiant's planet-swallowing cyclones. The particle jet has reached its zenith. The flux tube's rain of energy penetrates the tormented lower atmosphere. It is embraced by the live sylph. Their minds consume the power, using it to metamorphose once again. The nodes brought them sentience. The supergiant's surplus energy brings them transcendence. They leave the chrysalis of the flesh behind, shooting up the stream of particles at light speed, space free and eternal. The liberated minds swarm above their abandoned world for several days, watching the storms abate, the clouds reform, the old convection currents return to their familiar courses. The Lysilph have achieved incorporeality, but their perspective, shaped by the formative material existence, remains unchanged. As before, they deemed the purpose of their life is experience, perhaps eventually to be followed by understanding. The difference is that they are no longer restricted to a single world and brief glimpses of the stars. Now the entire universe is laid out before them. They wish to know it all. They begin to drift away from the odd planet which birthed them, tentatively at first, then with greater boldness, dispersing like an expanding wave of eager ghosts. One day they will return to this point, all the generations of Lysilph that ever lived. It will not happen while the primary star still burns. They will travel until they meet the boundary of the universe as it contracts once more, following the galactic superclusters as they fall into the reborn dark mass at the center, the cosmic egg regathering all it has lost. Then they will be back, congregating around the black star husk, sharing the knowledge they have brought, searching through it for that elusive, ultimate understanding. And after understanding, they will know what lies beyond, and with that, a hope of a further switch to yet another level of existence. Possibly the Lysilph will be the only entities to survive the present universe's final reconfiguration. But until then, they are content to observe and learn. Their very nature precludes them from taking part in the myriad dramas of life and matter unfolding before their ethereal senses. Or so they believe. 3. Iasius had come back to Saturn to die. 350,000 kilometers above the gas giant's one beige cloudscape, the wormhole terminus expanded, and the Void Hawk slipped out into real space. Sensors mounted on the strategic defense satellites patrolling the gas giant's designated Starship emergent zone found the infrared glow straight away as radar waves tickled the hull. Iasius hailed the nearest habitat with its affinity and identified itself. The satellite sensors slid their focus away, resuming their vigil. Captain and crew borrowed the Bitech Starship's paramount senses to observe the glorious ringed planet outside, whilst all the time their minds wept with the knowledge of what was to come. They were flying above the gas giant's sunlit hemisphere, a nearly full crescent showing. The rings were spread out ahead and 2 degrees below them, seemingly solid yet stirring, as if a gritty gas had been trapped between 2 panes of glass. Starlight twinkled through. Such majestic beauty seemed to deny their terrible reason for returning. Iasius's affinity touched their minds. "Feel no sorrow," the Bitech Starship said silently. "I do not. What is, is. You have helped to fill my life. For that, I thank you." Alone in her cabin, Captain Athene felt her mental tears become real. She was as tall as any woman of the 100 families, whose geneticists had concentrated on enhancing sturdiness, so their descendants could comfortably spend a lifetime coping with the arduous conditions of spaceflight. Her carefully formatted evolution had given her a long, handsome face, now heavily wrinkled, and rich auburn hair, which had lost its youthful sheen to a lustrous silver. In her immaculate ocean blue ship tunic, she projected a regal quality of assurance, which always elicited total confidence from her crews. But now her composure had vanished, expressive violet eyes reflecting the utter anguish welling up inside. "No, Athene, please don't." "I can't help it," her mind cried back. "It's so unfair. We should go together. We should be allowed." There was an eldritch caress down her spine, more tender than any human lover could ever bestow. She had felt that same touch on every day of all her 108 years, her only true love. None of her 3 husbands received as much emotional devotion as Iasius, nor, she admitted with something approaching sacrilege, had her 8 children, and 3 of them she had carried in her own womb. But other Edenists understood and sympathized. With their communal affinity there was no hiding emotions or truth. The birth bond between the Voidhawks and their captains was strong enough to survive anything the universe could possibly throw at them. Except death, the most private section of her mind whispered. "It is my time," Iasius said simply. There was an overtone of contentment within the silent voice. If the Voidhawk had had lungs, Athene thought it would have sighed at that moment. "I know," she said wistfully. It had been increasingly obvious during the last few weeks. The once omnipotent energy patterning cells were now struggling to open a wormhole interstice, where over half a century ago there had been a feeling that a single swallow maneuver could span the galaxy. The pair of them now experienced a muted sense of relief if a planned 15 light-year swallow was accomplished only a light month short of the required coordinate. "Damn the geneticists! Is parity so much to ask for?" she demanded. "One day, perhaps they will make the ship and captain live as long as each other. But this which we have now, I feel a rightness to it. Someone has to mother our children. You will be as good a mother as you have been a captain. I know this." The sudden burst of self-satisfied conviction in the mental voice made her grin. Sticky lashes batted some of the moisture away. "Raising 10 children at my age? Goodness, you will do well. They will prosper. I am happy." "I love you, Iasius. If I was allowed to have my life again, I would never change a second of it." "I would." "You would?" she asked, startled. "Yes, I would spend one day as a human, to see what it was like. Believe me, both the pleasures and the pain are greatly exaggerated." Iasius chuckled. Optically sensitive cells, protruding like blisters from its hull, located the Romulus habitat, and the starship felt for its mass with a tiny ripple in the spatial distortion field its energy patterning cells were generating. The habitat's solidity registered in its consciousness, a substantial moat orbiting the outside edge of the F-ring. Substantial but hollow, a bitech polyp cylinder 45 kilometers long, 10 wide. It was one of the 2 original Voidhawk bases germinated by the 100 families back in 2225. There were 268 similar habitats orbiting Saturn now, along with their subsidiary industrial stations, their numbers tangible evidence of just how important the bitech starships had become to the whole Edenist economy. The starship sent power flashing through its patterning cells, focusing energy towards infinity, the loci distorting space outside the hull, but never enough to open a wormhole interstice. They rode the distortion wave towards the habitat like a surfer racing for the beach, quickly accelerating to 3Gs. A secondary manipulation of the distortion field generated a counter-acceleration force for the benefit of the crew, providing them an apparent acceleration of 1G. A smooth and comfortable ride, unmatched by Adamist starships with their fusion drives. Athene knew she would never be quite so comfortable if she ever took a trip in a Voidhawk again. With Iasius, she could always feel the nothingness of the vacuum flowing by, a sensation she equated with being in a rowing boat on some country river, and letting her hand trail through the calm water. Passengers never received that feeling. Passengers were meat. "Go on," she told the starship. "Call for them." "All right." She smiled for both of them at the eagerness in the tone. Iasius called, opening its affinity full, projecting a wordless shout of joy and sorrow over a spherical zone 30 astronomical units in radius, calling for mates. Like all Voidhawks, Iasius was a creature of deep space, unable to operate close to the confines of a strong gravity field. It had a lenticular shape, measuring 110 meters in diameter, 30 meters deep at the center. The hull was a tough polyp, midnight blue in color, its outer layer gradually boiling away in the vacuum, replaced by new cells growing up from the mitosis layer. Internally, 20% of its mass was given over to specialist organs, nutrient reserve bladders, heart pumps supplying the vast capillary network, and neuron cells, all packaged together neatly within a cylindrical chamber at the center of the body. The remaining 80% of its bulk was made up from a solid honeycomb of energy patterning cells, which generated the spatial distortion field it used for both propulsion modes. It was those cells which were decaying in ever larger quantities. Like human neurons, they were unable to regenerate effectively, which dictated the starship's life expectancy. Voidhawks rarely saw out more than 110 years. Both the upper and lower hull surfaces had a wide circular groove halfway out from the middle, which the mechanical systems were slotted into. The lower hull groove was fitted mainly with cradles for cargo pods, the circle of folded titanium struts interrupted only by a few sealed ancillary systems modules. Crew quarters nestled in the upper hull groove, a chrome-silver toroid equipped with lounges, cabins, a small hangar for the atmospheric flyer, fusion generators, fuel, life support units. Human essentials. Athene walked around the toroid's central corridor one last time. Her current husband, Sinon, accompanied her as she performed her final sacrosanct duty, initiating the children who would grow up to be the captains of the next generation. There were 10 of them, zygotes, Athene's over-fertilized with sperm from her 3 husbands and 2 dear lovers. They had been waiting in 0 tau from the moment of conception, protected from entropy, ready for this day. Sinon had provided the sperm for only 1 child, but walking beside her, he found he held no resentment. He was from the original 100 families. Several of his ancestors had been captains, as well as 2 of his half-siblings. For just 1 of his own children to be given the privilege was honor enough. The corridor had a hexagonal cross-section, its surface made out of a smooth pale green composite that glowed from within. Athene and Sinon walked at the head of the silent procession of the 7-strong crew, air whirring softly from overhead grills the only sound. They came to a section of the corridor where the composite strip of the lower wall angle merged seamlessly with the hull, revealing an oval patch of the dark blue polyp. Athene stopped before it. "This egg I name Inuni," Iasius said. The polyp bulged up at the center, its apex thinning as it rose, becoming translucent. Red rawness showed beneath it, the crest of a stem as thick as a human leg, which stretched right down into the core of the starship's body. The tumescent apex split open, dribbling a thick gelatinous goo onto the corridor's floor. Inside, the sphincter muscle at the top of the red stem dilated, looking remarkably similar to a waiting, toothless mouth. The dark tube inside palpitated slowly. Athene held up the Bitech Sustinator, a sphere 5 centimeters in diameter, flesh purple, maintained at body temperature. According to the data core on the 0 tau pod it had been kept in, the zygote inside was female. It was also the one Sinon had fathered. She bent down and pushed it gently into the waiting orifice. "This child I name Syrinx." The little sustinator globe was ingested with a quiet, wet slope. The sphincter lips closed, and the stem sank back down out of sight. Sinon patted her shoulder, and they gave each other a proud smile. "They will flourish together." Iasius said proudly. Yes. Athene walked on. There were another 4 zygotes left to initiate, and Romulus was growing larger outside. The Saturn habitats were keening their regret at Iasius's call. Voidhawks throughout the solar system answered with pride and camaraderie. Those that weren't outbound with cargo abandoned their flights to flock around Romulus in anticipation. Iasius curved gently round the non-rotational dock at the northern end cap. With her eyes closed, Athene let the affinity bond image from the Voidhawk's sensor blisters expand into her mind with superhuman clarity. Her visual reference of the habitat altered as the end cap loomed large beyond the rim of the starship's hull. She saw the vast expanse of finely textured red-brown polyp as an approaching cliff face. One with 4 concentrically arrayed ledges, as if ripples had raced out from the axis in some distant time, only to be frozen as they peaked. The Voidhawk chased after the second ledge, 2 kilometers out from the axis, swooping round to match the habitat's rotation. Atomist reaction drive spaceships didn't have anything like the maneuverability necessary to land on the ledges, and they were reserved for Voidhawks alone. Iasius shot in over the edge, seeming to hover above the long rank of mushroom-like docking pedestals which protruded from the floor, before choosing a vacant one. For all its bulk, it alighted with the delicate grace of a hummingbird. Athene and Sinon felt the gravity fade down to half a G as the distortion field dissipated. She watched the big, flat-tired crew bus rolling slowly towards the Bitech starship, elephant snout airlock tube held upwards. "Come along," Sinon urged, his mind dark with emotion. He touched her elbow, seeing all too plainly the wish to remain during the last flight. She nodded her head reluctantly. "You're right," she said out loud. "I'm sorry, that doesn't make it any easier." She gave him a tired smile and allowed him to lead her out of the lounge. The bus had arrived at the rim of the Voidhawk, its airlock tube lengthened, sliding over the upper hull surface to reach the crew toroid. Sinon diverted his attention away from his wife to the flock of Voidhawks matching pace with the ledge. There were over 70 waiting, latecomers rising into view as they left their crews behind on the other ledges. The emotional backwash from the waiting Bitech starships was impossible to filter out, and he could feel his own blood singing in response. It wasn't until he and Athene reached the passage to the airlock that he noticed an irregularity in the flock. Iasius obligingly focused on the starship in question. "That's a Blackhawk!" Sinon exclaimed. Amidst the classic lens shapes, it seemed oddly asymmetric, drawing the eye. A flattened teardrop, slightly asymmetric, with the upper hull's dorsal bulge fatter than that on the lower hull. From what he supposed was prow to stern, it measured an easy 130 meters. The blue polyp hull was mottled with a tattered purple web pattern. The larger size and various unorthodox configurations which set the Blackhawks apart, their divergence from the Voidhawk norm, some called it evolution, came about because of their captain's requirement for greater power. Actually, improved combat performance was what they were after, Sinon thought acrimoniously. The price for that agility usually came in the form of a shorter lifespan. "That is the Udat," Iasius said equably. "It is fast and powerful, a worthy aspirant." "There's your answer, then," Athene said, using Affinity's singular engagement mode so the rest of the crew were excluded from the exchange. She had a gleam in her eye as they paused by the airlock's inner hatch. Sinon pulled a sour face, then shrugged and walked off down the tube to the bus, giving her the final moment alone with her ship. There was a hum in the corridor she had never heard before, a resonance coming from Iasius's excitement. When she put her fingers to the sleek composite wall, there was nothing. No tremor or vibration. Perhaps it was only in her mind. She turned and looked back into the toroid, the familiar confined corridors and lounges, their whole world. "Goodbye," she whispered. "I will love you always." The crew bus trundled back over the ledge towards the cliff of polyp, nuzzling up to a metal airlock set into the base. Iasius laughed uproariously across the communal affinity band, It could feel the 10 eggs inside its body, glowing with vitality, their urgency to be born. Without warning, it streaked away from the pedestal, straight towards the waiting flock of its cousins. They scattered in delighted alarm. This time there was no counter-acceleration force required for the crew toroid, no protection for fragile humans, no artificial safety limits. Iasius curved sharply, pulling an easy 9 Gs, then flattened its trajectory to fly between the end cap and the giant metal arm of the counter-rotating dock. Weak pearl-white sunlight fell on the hull as it moved out of the ledge's shadow. Saturn lay ahead, the razor-sharp line of the rings bisecting it cleanly. The Vitek starship headed in for the planet's swathing streamers of ice crystals and primitive molecules at 12 Gs. Stray dust motes and particles brushed smoothly aside by the distortion field's bow wave. Enthusiastic void hawks raced after it, looking more and more like a stippled comet's tail as they emerged into the light. In the crew quarters, metal was buckling under its new and enormous weight. Empty lounges and corridors were filled with drawn-out creaking sounds. Composite furniture was splintering, collapsing onto the floor, each fresh fragment hitting with the force of a hammer blow, leaving a deep indentation. The cabins and galley were awash with water that squirted from broken pipes. Strange ripples quivered across the surface as Iasius performed minute course adjustments. Iasius entered the rings, optical band perception degrading rapidly as the blizzard raging outside the hull thickened. It curved round again, bending its path in the direction which the ring particles orbited, but always at an angle, always heading inwards towards the massive presence of the gas giant. It was a glorious game, dodging the larger chunks, the dagger fragments of ice which glittered so coldly, the frosted boulders, sable black chunks of near-pure carbon. The Vitek starship soared around them all, spiraling, diving, swooping in huge loops, heedless of the stress, of the toll its frenzy extracted from the precious patterning cells. Energy was free, coursing through the ring. Cosmic radiation, the planet's undulating magnetic flux, the doughty gusts of solar wind. Iasius swept it all in with the distortion field, concentrating it into an abundant, coherent stream which the patterning cells absorbed and redirected. By the time it reached the Enker division, the power surplus was enough to energize the first egg. Iasius let out a shrill cry of triumph. The other void hawks responded. They had followed tenaciously, striving to match the giddy helter-skelter route Iasius had flown, boring down the passage it had broken through the ring mats, desperately deflecting the whirling particles tossed about by its wake. The leader of the flock kept changing. None could equal the speed, nor match the carefree audacity. Often they were caught out by the savage turns, overshooting, blundering about in a squall of undisturbed particles. It was a test of skill as well as power. Even luck played a part. Luck was a trait worth inheriting. When Iasius called the first time, Hyale was the closest, a mere 200 kilometers behind. It surged forward and Iasius relented, slowing fractionally, holding a straight course. They rendezvoused, Hyale sliding in to hold position 10 meters away, their hulls overlapping perfectly. Ring particles skidded round them like snow from a ski blade. Hyale began to impart its compositional pattern through their affinity bond, a software DNA flowing into Iasius with a sense of near-orgasmic glory. Iasius incorporated the Hyale structural format into the vast energy squirt it discharged into the first egg. The egg, Acetes, awoke in a blaze of wonder and exhilaration, alive with racing currents of power, every cell charged with rapture and purpose and the urge to burst into immediate growth. Iasius filled space with its glee. Acetes found itself propelled out into the naked vacuum. Shattered fragments of Iasius's hull were spinning away, a dark red hole set in midnight blue receding at a bewildering speed. "Free!" the egg sang. "I'm free!" A huge dark bulk hung over it. Forces it could sense but couldn't understand were slowing its wild tumbling. The universe seemed to be composed entirely of tiny splinters of matter pervaded by glowing energy bands. Voidhawks flashed past at frightening velocities. "Yes, you are free," Hayali said. "I bid you welcome to life." "What is this place? What am I? Why can't I move like you?" Ascites struggled to make sense of the scraps of knowledge fluttering around its racing mind. Iasius's final gift. "Patience," Hayali counseled. "You will grow. You will learn. The data you possess will be integrated in time." Ascites cautiously opened its affinity sensitivity to cover the whole of Saturn's environment, and received a chorus of greetings from the habitats, an even greater wave of acknowledgement from individual adult hedonists, excited trills from children, and then its own kind offered encouragement, infant voidhawks nesting within the rings. Its tumbling halted. It hung below Hayali's lower hull, looking round with raw senses. Hayali began to alter their trajectory, moving the egg into a stable circular orbit around the gas giant, where it would spend the next 18 years, growing to full size. Iasius plunged on towards the cloudscape, ploughing a dark telltale furrow through the rings for any entity watching with the right kind of senses. Its flight produced enough power to energize 2 more eggs, Briseis and Epopeus, while it was still in the A-ring. Hesperus emerged while it was passing through the Cassini division. Griae, Ixion, Laocoon, and Merope all awoke in the B-ring, to be borne away by the Voidhawks whose compositional patterns they had been given. Udat caught up with Iasius near the inner edge of the B-ring. It had been a long, arduous flight, straining even the Black Hawk's power reserves, testing maneuverability as seldom before. But now Iasius was calling for a mate again, and Udat glided across the gap until their distortion fields merged and the hulls almost touched. It sent Iasius its own compositional pattern through the affinity bond, swept away by a fervent gratification. "I thank you," Iasius said at the end. "I feel this one will be something special. There is a greatness to it." The egg cannoned up from its ovary, sending out a cascade of polyp flakes, and Udat was left to exert its distortion field to break the intrigued, eager infant as Iasius departed. The puzzled Black Hawk had no chance to ask what it had meant by that last enigmatic statement. "I welcome you to life," Udat said formally, when it had finally stopped the 7-meter globe from spinning. "Thank you," Inoni replied. "Where are we going now?" "To a higher orbit. This one is too close to the planet." "Oh!" A pause as it probed round with immature senses, its giddy thoughts quietening down. "What is a planet?" The last egg was Priam, ejected well below the meager lip of the B-ring. Those Voidhawks remaining in the flight, now down to some 30 strong, peeled away from Iasius. They were already dangerously close to the cloudscape which dominated a third of the sky. Gravity was exerting its malign influence on local space, gnawing at the fringes of their distortion fields, impairing the propulsive efficiency. Iasius continued to descend, its lower, faster orbit carrying it ahead of the others. Its distortion field began to falter, finally overwhelmed by the intensity of the gravitational effect 500 kilometers above the gas giant. The Terminator rose ahead, a black occlusion devouring the silently meandering clouds. Faint phosphine speckles swam through the eddies and peaks, weaving in and out of the thicker ammonia-laden braids, their light ebbing and kindling in hesitant patterns. Iasius shot into the penumbra, darkness expanding around it like an elemental force. Saturn had ceased to be a planet, an astronomical object. It was becoming hugely solid. The Bitech starship curved down at an ever-increasing angle. Ahead of it was a single fiery streak, growing brighter in its optical sensors. The dark side equator, that frozen remote wasteland, was redolent with sublime grandeur. Ring particles were falling alongside Iasius, a thick dark rain, captured by the gossamer fingers of the ionosphere, a treacherously insistent caress which robbed them of speed, of altitude, and ultimately existence. When they had been lured down to the fringes of the ionosphere, icy gusts of hydrogen molecules burned around them, emitting banners of spectral flame. They dipped rapidly as atmospheric resistance built, first glowing like embers, then crowned by incandescent light, sunsparks stretching 100-kilometer contrail behind them. The billion-year flight ended swiftly in a violent spectacle, a dazzling concussion which flung out a shower of twinkling debris, quickly extinguished. All that remained was a tenuous trail of black soot, which was swept up by the howling cyclones. Iasius reached the extremity of the ionosphere. The light of the dying ring particles was hot on its lower hull. A tremulous glow appeared around its rim. Polyp began to char and flake away, orange flecks bulleting off into the distance. The Bitech starship began to lose peripheral senses as its specialist receptor cells grew warm. Dense layers of hydrogen pummeled the hull. The descent curve began to get bumpy. Vexatious supersonic winds were beginning to bite. Iasius flipped over. The abrupt turn had disastrous consequences on its avian glide. With the hull's blunt underside smashing head-on into the hydrogen, the starship was suddenly subjected to a huge deceleration force. Dangerous quantities of flame blossomed right across the hull as broad swaths of polyp ablated. Iasius started to tumble helplessly down towards the scorching river of light. The retinue of Void Hawks watched solemnly from their safe orbit 1,000 kilometers above, singing their silent hymn of mourning. After they had honored Iasius's passing with a single orbit, they extended their distortion fields and launched themselves back towards Romulus. The human captains of the Void Hawks involved with the mating flight and the Iasius's crew had passed the time of the flight in a circular hall, reserved for that one purpose. It reminded Athene of some of the medieval churches she had visited during her rare trips to Earth. The same vaulted ceiling and elaborate pillars, the intimidating air of reverence, though here the polyp walls were a clean snow white, and instead of an altar, there was a fountain bubbling out of an antique marble Venus. She stood at the head of her crew, the image of Saturn's searing equator lingering in her mind, a last gentle emanation of peacefulness as the plasma sheath wrapped Iasius in its terminal embrace. It was over. The captains stopped by one at a time to extend their congratulations, their minds touching hers, bestowing a fragile compassion and understanding. Never, ever a commiseration. These gatherings were supposed to be a reaffirmation of life, celebrating the birth of the eggs, and Iasius had energized all 10. Some Void Hawks went to meet the equator with several eggs remaining. Yes, they were right to toast Iasius. "He's coming over. Look," Sinon said. There was a mild tone of resentment in the thought. Athene raised her eyes from the captain of the Pelion and observed Maia making his way through the crowd towards her. The Udat's captain was a broad-shouldered man in his late 30s, black hair cut back close to his skull. In contrast to the silky blue ceremonial ship tunics of the Void Hawk captains, he wore a functional grey-green ship's one-piece and matching boots. He nodded curtly in response to the formal greetings he received. "If you can't say anything nice," Athene told Sinon,